Welcome back to another episode of the Renewable Energy Movement podcast. In today's episode, I'm speaking to Jan Rosenow about the systems level changes of driving Europe's energy transition. Jan has been in the space for over 20 years. His passion for sustainability and environmental protection going as far back as when he was 8 years old and founded an environmental group in his local town. Since then, he's gone on to advise the UK Parliament, shaped EU energy policy, and now leads research at the University of Oxford. This is a really interesting episode where we take a look at the important topics in our industry from a different perspective. We cover how solar went from a niche, subsidised technology to the cheapest electricity source on the planet, why government policies matter, but market forces matter more, the future of long-duration storage and grid integration, and what universities and private companies should be doing better together. Let's get right into it. Next episode today of the REM Renewable Energy Movement podcast. My guest is Jan Rosenow. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Jan, maybe it's good for you to give a formal introduction to the audience, which I'm sure is much better than mine.
Yeah, hi Tom. Thanks for having me. So my name is Jan Rosenow, and you almost got that right. And I've been working in the energy sector for more than 20 years now. So I started out my career in 2004, and I'm currently leading the energy research program at the University of Oxford, and previously was vice president of a global non-profit called the Regulatory Assistance Project, or in short, RAP. And before that, worked in consultancy for a number of clients, government, private sector, trade associations, etc. So yeah, a lot of work in research, consultancy, and non-profit over the years.
Awesome, great stuff. Well, let's dive right back into it, to the beginning of your career then. What was it that initially got you interested in kind of climate and sustainability work?
Well, it goes back actually many years, actually decades. When I was 8 years old, I founded an environmental group in my local town, and that was very much inspired by, I think, my upbringing and my parents, who were both very committed environmentalists. And in that context, I got very interested in, just the local ecosystem around me, and deep sense of wanting to contribute to protecting what we have on this planet. And I think that's been driving me ever since. So that got me really into sustainability more broadly. And then the interest in energy in particular, that happened, I think, probably about 22 years ago, when I started to work on some of the impacts of our energy system. And in particular, I was paying attention a lot to German lignite production. That's where I grew up in Germany. And I started to work on the impacts of lignite on the environment, which are absolutely huge. I mean, you may have seen some of those lignite open pit mines, but they are miles in diameter. They're absolutely vast and huge impact. So I was really interested in, what are those impacts, and also what are the alternatives to doing that? How can we create a more sustainable energy system that doesn't require, these very significant, quite negative environmental impacts, on the ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, you were. That's the earliest I think I've ever heard anyone say that their experience went back in many ways. So you were massively ahead of your time, or ahead of the trend, I would say, as these topics weren't kind of on people's radars in the way they are today. What was the kind of reaction from people around you? Maybe not as far back as when you were 8, but certainly when you first got into the interest around the mines, etc.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. When I did my undergrad, and I studied geosciences, environmental sciences, when I told people what I was studying, they were looking at me slightly startled, saying, "Why would you want to do that? You're going to be a cab driver. You're going to be unemployed. Why don't you do something properly?" I think is what they were thinking. And interestingly, when I now, and people now ask me, "What do you do?" and I say I work on sort of energy and sustainable energy, they think, "Oh, wow, what an amazing topic, and you must be so busy." So things have really changed, and it's been so interesting for me to see how the industry has changed, the discussion has changed over the last 20 years. It's really exciting, and often people will kind of ask me, where do I get my energy from, and sort of my optimism, given that the world is clearly not going in the right direction when it comes to carbon emissions. We're still emitting more than we used to in the past, but I think there's so many positive things that have happened, and I'm happy to go into that if you want me to, Tom. But I think there's been a tremendous change over the 20 years, the last 20 years or so. So it's been amazing, I think.
Yeah, maybe it's a nice little segue to a few experiences of what are the most positive things that you've seen over the past 20 years. Yeah, positive changes.
Yeah, I mean, let me give you one example. When I first looked at the cost of solar back in 2004, I think it was, and compare that to any of the other alternative, coal and gas and nuclear. Really, solar was struggling to even break even. It was just way more expensive, and the only way you could justify solar was saying, oh, there's all these environmental benefits, and we should subsidize it, and then you can somehow see how the economics were beginning to stack up, but with great difficulty. And fast forward 20 years, and solar is the cheapest way of generating electricity in most places in the world now. Even if you throw in batteries, it's quite dramatic, the change in the cost reduction we have seen with solar. And there's so many other examples of that. You think of electric vehicles, we didn't really have any until recently in terms of many different models. Yes, there might have been the Tesla Roadster, and sort of very expensive luxury cars, but having a market where you have hundreds of models, that is a new thing, and it's exciting. If people asked me 15 years ago, will it be electric cars or hydrogen cars, I think at that point it was very much still, well, I'm not quite sure where things are headed, and now it's pretty clear. So there's just so many stories like that where I think innovation has really shown us what is possible if we really put our minds to it.
Yeah, indeed. Maybe we'll get onto it a little bit later. I'm also interested to see what's coming next. It's quite hard to predict, as you say sometimes, but the innovation and the change in the past, probably 5 years has been to me from the outside eye in a way that the greatest. So I'm kind of really interested to see what the next 5, 10, 20 can bring as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's the exciting thing about the future. Nobody really knows, and often we get it badly wrong. We tend, I think, as the human race, to underestimate how quickly things can change and how dramatic these changes can be. I mean, think about the smartphone, right? When I remember when that came out, and very few people had it, and I remember some of the comments being made by the CEOs, of the mobile phone companies, saying, "Oh yeah, who wants to buy a phone with no buttons on it?" And people dismissing it outright, and then fast forward just 5 years, and complete revolution has happened because of that innovation that took place. So I think we're going to be surprised, if anything, because a lot of the things that we will use in 20 years probably don't exist yet. Maybe someone has an idea and there might be a concept, but they certainly haven't been demonstrated yet. So I think there's quite a bit of that. And then there's going to be just scaling the stuff we know is working already. I mean, I mentioned solar before, wind, batteries, EVs, heat pumps. We're going to see a lot of these technologies scale because they now reach the stage where they are mature, there's a market for them. And that will just continue. So I think it's going to be that combination of scaling what we know works already, and then some new tech on top of that is currently not even on our radar.
On our radar, indeed. You've mentioned it a couple of times already, but I'm particularly interested to talk about experience with government and governmental issues. I think if you go back to solar back in 2004, was almost impossible to run without certain subsidies. The change in government is a topic, or changes in government is a topic that I come up with a lot from a recruiting experience. How have you seen changes in government affect exactly what's happening within energy and sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, it's on the one hand, I think government is a really important actor in this, because government can kickstart a technology by providing subsidy. We've seen that in a number of markets. You may think about the feed-in tariff scheme that many countries adopted, including the UK. Germany, I think, most prominently was sort of an early mover on that, and that really helped to kickstart some of the renewable energy technologies to grow. So a government has a really important role, and also in it sets the framework in which for the market overall. So it's really important. On the other hand, I think some of the politics and the flip flopping that we've seen is clearly not helpful, and this sort of stop-start nature of some of the initiatives that come out of government because of elections and change of direction. But has that really made a fundamental difference to the direction of travel? I don't think it has. I mean, even the US, where in 2016 Donald Trump was elected, and you might remember those photos where he was wearing a hard hat, and I think it was people were holding up a banner saying Trump digs coal, and he was sort of saying he's going to bring back the coal industry in the US. And you look at the actual numbers, the coal generation after 2016, between 2016 and 2020, when the Trump administration was in power, has declined faster than ever before. And that's not because of Trump wanted it to decline, but it just happened because of the market fundamentals really changing. Coal was simply not as competitive anymore as it used to be, and therefore was completely independent of any government policy. It just happened because of these very significant underlying structural forces, market forces. And I believe that is the case also now. When you look at some of the posturing that we see, yes, it will not be helpful. It will not help to accelerate. But can you really stop some of those innovations that have happened already? I highly doubt it. It's not in the hands of policymakers to do that. They can make it harder. They can slow it down. But I think some of this is, it's happening. It's been set into motion. And I think the role of government is still very important. It can make sure things are happening faster and accelerated, and especially kickstart some other technologies that we haven't seen yet. But I really don't think that the politics will get in the way fundamentally of this transition that we now see happening.
Yeah, I really happy that you said that. I have similar conversations quite regularly, and the way I often describe it is, a 4-year term or even an 8-year term is not going to affect the bigger picture, that the price of solar continue decreasing, for example, or renewable energy decreasing in price over a 100-year period, let alone kind of 20 or 10. Just on that, I think you've spent some time in both advising the House of Commons in the UK and also in the European Commission. Can you talk a little bit about how that experience was, or how those experiences?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that is right. So maybe I start with the House of Commons, because that was quite curious how that came about. So there was a competition, I think, for the first time I think it might have been 2019 or 2020. I think it was around just before COVID. I think the House of Commons Select Committee for I think it was Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, the BASE Select Committee in the House of Commons. They were putting a call out saying anyone from the general public can propose a topic that they would like the committee to look at in an inquiry. These committees, they usually have a number of topics. They're going to look at it in an inquiry. Then they invite witnesses. They might invite people from government. They write a big report. They make recommendations. And selecting those topics is usually done by the members of parliament on that committee. In this case, they said, we want the public to tell us what they think is really important, and then we're going to select the topics from those submissions, and we actually run a full-scale inquiry. So I saw that, I thought, I'm just going to pitch something to them, and I spent 10 minutes writing a paragraph and just sending it off, thinking nothing will ever come of it. And they had 270 submissions or something like that. And then I get an email and saying, well, you're now invited to pitch to the committee directly. So there was a second stage, where you have to give a 5-minute pitch, and they then ask you some questions. Did that as well. That was during lockdown. And then shortly after that, I was told, well, your topic was selected as the first inquiry this committee is now going to look at. And by the way, would you like to become a special advisor to the committee, because you're an expert in that area? And so it was on decarbonising heat. That was a topic I suggested, because there had never been an inquiry into that, and I thought it would be really important to do that. So that's how it came about. And then the actual work is very much thinking, what are the questions the members of parliament should look into? Who should they invite? Which experts should they consult with? Who should be witnesses? What material should they be aware of, and then help them draft the report, and ultimately draft the policy recommendations. So it's a kind of the full circle from the initial idea for the topic all the way to here's the report, with some recommendations, and you often then see the end result. As someone who's reading the news, you will just see on the BBC website or somewhere, this committee is asking government to do X, but there's of course usually a year or so of work that goes into that. So that was the House of Commons experience. Very interesting because it gives you an insight into how kind of your government, not government so much, but how the House of Commons works, and how Parliament works in the UK. And then I think the Commission, that's a totally different way of working. So the European Commission, of course, is able to influence 27 other countries in Europe through its legislation, and there's almost continuous review of legislation happening. There's always something that is currently under review or will be coming under. So there's always an opportunity to work with the Commission on something. And the first time I did that, I think, was back in 2013 or 2012, when I was in charge of evaluating the implementation of the Energy Efficiency Directive in Europe. At the time, there were 28 countries, of course, with the UK still being part of the European Union. And my task was to look at every single country and assess, has this country done well, not so well, or really badly on implementing that directive? And that's a huge task, because you have to then look at the reports that they produce, which are usually quite detailed and very technical, and then you have to make sure they are robust. So you might have to interview some experts or look at some other evidence, and then report back to the Commission. That was my first encounter with EU policy in that sort of way. And ever since, I've sort of given advice to the Commission, either as a formal consultant or even in just having a conversation in a workshop setting or in private meetings, where they're just looking for new ideas, or they're looking to get some feedback on what's working, what isn't working so well. But it's a fascinating institution. It's very complicated. EU policy making is not straightforward. It sometimes is quite messy, but it's also hugely rewarding when you see how ideas that you have suddenly actually mature and become reality in a way, because they inspired some people to do some things differently.
Yeah, I was going to ask on both of them, really. Have you seen policies implemented or begin to be implemented from the work that you've done?
Yes, it's very rare, I would say, that you say, government should consider implementing this particular policy and this is how it should be implemented, that actually happens. Yeah. Because of the complication of the process, involves a lot of stakeholders, they all feed into that. And in the end, policies are compromises. And it's very rare that a single person has the ability to determine what's in their policy. But what I certainly have seen is suggestions for reform or suggestions for a new policy instrument being picked up and then implemented eventually. But it's as I said, it's rare that it's a single person. So I wouldn't claim, that was me. I've given the impetus for that particular policy or that change in policy. But I've certainly seen my work being translated into policy in a number of ways, and that's very rewarding. That doesn't happen easily. You can't just publish an article saying government should be doing this and then it happens. You need to be, I think, it needs to be informed by good evidence, and it needs to be presented in a way that it's accessible for people. But there's definitely opportunities. Anyone who has some great ideas can potentially do that. It's a question of whether you get heard and whether what you present is credible and actually fits with the current moment.
Yeah, I guess it's testament to you for being a true expert in your field, right? Because one thing that I know there are experts in the room, but if you go back to the UK example, there won't be a load of energy experts sitting in the House of Commons, so it's good that they use that from outside. Is there synergy in what the UK and the EU are aiming towards, without getting too much?
Yeah, I'd say so. I think broadly there is, because the targets that both the EU and the UK have are not that dissimilar. I mean, decarbonizing the economy, ensuring industrial competitiveness is now a big topic. For energy affordability, yeah, it's the same issues that the European Union is grappling with as the UK. So there's no significant fundamental difference. It's not like we have, the stark difference with the US now. We don't have that in Europe. Most countries are basically trying to get into the same direction, and that's no different for the UK.
Yeah. Okay. Good to hear. Without getting too deep into Brexit, what collaboration is happening now between the private sector and policymakers? And could anything be improved to reach the net zero targets that we have on time?
I mean, the private sector has, I think, played a very important role in actually delivering a lot of this. I mean, government does listen to the private sector a lot, sometimes too much, you might say, or only to certain parts of the private sector. But no, there's a tremendous amount of exchange between public and private sector that's happening. What is sometimes frustrating is when parts of the private sector that are particularly well connected, usually incumbents who've been there for a long time, then shape policy, whereas perhaps newcomers, more disruptive companies that actually are more innovative have less access. I mean, we have seen that time and time again. And I think it's important for government to be aware of that and to give opportunity for some of those more innovative, perhaps less established players to feed into the discussion and into policy making. But there's certainly no shortage of exchange between the two sectors, I'd say, especially in the UK. They are very well intertwined.
Yeah. Yeah, good, as expected. And then, what specifically on kind of deployment of solar, wind, battery systems in Europe? What kind of regulatory or market design changes are most urgently needed, do you think, to accelerate the deployment of such systems?
I mean, solar is sort of happening now without very significant support, even because of the economics that we talked about before. I think what will be interesting is, can we get rid of gas generation in the electricity mix quickly? Because that is still one of the main drivers of high electricity prices in a lot of countries, where electricity prices are largely determined by the cost of gas, and large batteries could help replace that, which we've seen in California, in Texas, in Australia already. So I hope that we will see more emphasis on grid storage, large batteries that can help us do that, to get move away from gas faster, and go further. So I think that is something that hasn't really been done enough yet, to encourage that in Europe. And I'm sure we can learn some lessons from other places there where this has already happened. I mean, it's fairly recent that grid storage has become more competitive, and I think that's, yeah, you could think of a specific incentive mechanism, at least at the beginning, to encourage grid scale storage. But I'm not sure we need more subsidies for solar, right? It's more a question of making sure what gets deployed well, and in a way that supports the transition to a fully decarbonized electricity system, rather than just benefits a few individuals. I think that's important. We sometimes get that wrong when the incentives are designed in such a way that individuals benefit, but it's actually not necessarily a massive benefit for the energy system overall. So that I think that should be front and center, I think, for the next generation of renewable energy policies, and policies for grid storage.
Yeah, and indeed, I don't know what your thoughts are on kind of space and density of population, but do you think that plays a part in it? The three areas that you mentioned are generally, there's a lot of quite sparsely populated people, towns, etc. Whereas places in Europe, Amsterdam, places in Germany, UK, there isn't the same luxury.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, when you look at I mean, certainly on like rooftop solar, we still have vast potential in a lot of countries. Yeah, we're far from having exploited that. So rooftop solar still has tremendous potential. Doesn't need any additional land. But even when I think when you do the numbers, how much land do you actually need for ground-mounted solar to meet some of those very ambitious decarbonization scenarios? It's not that much. I think it's often overstated in the public debate that there's this competition between agriculture and electricity generation, but really we're not talking about 20 or 30% of the land. It's a small fraction of the land that will be needed for deploying renewables. It's not that much, and of course in the UK, for example, where I live, offshore wind has really taken off. So the impact on agriculture from wind is pretty minimal because most of it is currently offshore, and I think offshore wind had a tougher time compared to solar recently, but there's still a lot of potential and there's a lot of projects on the way in Europe to grow that industry, and I do hope that it will continue to grow because it clearly has made a huge contribution to decarbonization already.
Just to touch a little bit on your kind of academia and education now, I think you you work with some of the best universities in the world. Specifically, I think Oxford, Cambridge, and Sussex as well. How do you see the energy transition being tackled in universities, or how do you tackle it?
Well, universities actually have, I think, a really important role potentially because I mean, not so much perhaps when it comes to deploying renewables that we just talked about, but more, well, most of the energy use of universities will be in the buildings that they own, and often those buildings are quite old. They're not particularly well insulated. They have old heating systems, but because universities have a whole estate of buildings, you can then think about more systemic interventions. For example, district heating and cooling networks, which provide decarbonized heating and cooling for those buildings. So a lot of universities are now looking at that. But that's where most of the emissions are from. That and international travel and people going to conferences. But the direct emissions from the university's operations are basically the buildings that the universities own. And that's where still we need to see a lot of innovation, and universities can demonstrate how to do this well. So when you look at some of the really interesting examples, I mean, Stanford, for example, in the US, they had a district heating and cooling system for a long time now. It's not driven by renewables, but they have demonstrated the viability of having a campus-wide district heating and cooling approach early on. And I think the other universities in Europe could actually do something quite similar and copy that, but do it in a way that is zero carbon or low carbon. So I think that's where there's an important role for universities to demonstrate how that can be done. And then of course it's the research on really kind of cross-cutting, cutting edge topics where we just haven't figured out how things work yet, and universities play a very important role in that. And also then finally, I'd say understanding what works well in which places and translating that into implementable solutions elsewhere. I think again, universities can play that role as a sort of independent institution with no particular agenda other than providing good evidence to support better policy making.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Never, it would never ever cross my mind, to be honest with you, until you just mentioned it. That the size of an estate of a university has a big impact on decarbonisation. Do you advise on any of these topics? It doesn't sound like anywhere in the UK or Europe particularly ahead of the game on it.
Well, I mean, the University of Oxford, where I currently work, has certainly has plans to decarbonize its operations, as do pretty much all other universities too. And as part of that, I have been informally working with the team that's in charge of the energy management of the wider university estate. I'm not a formal advisor to them, but I've been in a number of meetings and conversations. And it's very exciting, but it's also very complex because you're dealing with institutions that are multi-layered. There are several departments, many buildings, many committees and subcommittees. It's not that straightforward. It's complicated, perhaps more complicated than if you take a big company that is more hierarchical. Universities tend to be organized a bit more bottom up, and that makes it harder potentially to do these things. But yeah, no, I'm very much following what's going on, and I think in November, actually, I'm speaking at an event by the higher education sector, which is all about what can the higher education sector do to support decarbonisation, not just within universities, but across the economy.
Oh, interesting. And just going back now to actually, young people, let's call it, entering into the sector. How have you seen the change since when you entered it to now? I imagine it's astronomically different.
Yeah, I mean, the number of jobs in clean energy is a totally different scale. There's lots of them. What we also see, though, is there's a lot more interest. There was a time, I think, where there was high demand and not enough people with the skill sets. There's now a vast number of master's programs, people really specializing in clean energy, coming out of university. And the market I think, is tougher for graduates than it was perhaps a few years ago. There's more competition. There's some great jobs, don't get me wrong, but there's certainly there's stiff competition. There's a lot of people coming into this sector because it has received, I think, so much attention. People are now quite switched on about it and sort of know that that is an interesting area to work in. But I'd say it's become a little bit harder perhaps to enter the job market. But there's still a plethora of interesting jobs that I see all of the time, and good people, will find some great opportunities in this market. There's no doubt. But the competition, especially at the graduate level, is stiff. There's no way of denying that. It's not like just because you have a master's degree from a decent university, even a world class university, that there's plenty of job offers waiting for you, and you can just pick and choose. You're up against a lot of other people. So I think it's ever more important to really be clear which part of that very large space you actually try to engage with. I think that's what I often find that people are sort of not sure, and I think they're at a disadvantage. If you have some idea, okay, I want to go into that part of the energy sector and start out there, you can specialize more, you can be more strategic. I think if you're not sure at all what you want to do, you just know it's something about energy, it's a lot harder than to be strategic and make the right connections with people in the industry, and then ultimately get it to the job market.
Yeah, so you've almost answered my next question there. I was going to say, what specifically, if you were advising somebody who wanted to get into this industry, what would they do? Your answer would be to be a little bit more specific earlier.
Yeah, and talk to as many people as possible. I'm still amazed, and I don't think it has changed fundamentally, how few people take advantage of the possibility of networking early on. Even when you're still doing your master's degree or even your undergrad degree, reaching out to people who do the work that you think you might want to be doing one day is a great way of getting a taste of what it might be like, whether it's actually is that for you, and building your network, and then hearing about the opportunities. Because I think that's one of the most challenging bits, is actually knowing when interesting opportunities arise, finding that out, because they might not come across your social media feed or your newsletter, and then it's all about somebody flagging to you, look, there's an interesting opportunity here, you might want to apply for that job, and that's so important. So building a network early, I think, is so important and can have huge benefits for not just for the people who you're looking for a job, but of course also for the people who are in senior positions and who are looking for talent and good people. So it's a win-win situation really. But I don't see people using that enough. I would really encourage folks who are thinking of, yeah, how do I get in the job market in the first place, to do it, to do the informal networking side of things, to find out what's required, how does it work, who's doing what, could this be an interesting job for me? And then you have a lot more clarity and you can answer the question, I think, much more persuasively. Why do you want this job? Why do you want to work for us? Because that's, I think, it's often where people find it very hard to give a persuasive answer. You know, they're interested in the topic broadly, and they have some understanding of what's required, but it's not specific enough. And I think that's where you can really refine your responses in interviews. And you can find out what's required, you know, what's important, what really matters, what are the hot topics, and you get a much better sense, I think, of what you should talk about in a job interview context.
Yeah, I think it's really great advice. I mean, I spoke briefly with you offline before we started about a community that I host within the kind of senior renewable space across Europe, and a lot of it is driven from the fact that I think there's networking is almost becoming a little bit of a dying art in many ways. I don't know what you think about 20 years in the industry, but I just feel like there's a decline in networking as the world becomes a little bit more online.
I think that's probably right. And some of the, I mean, I get a lot of messages on LinkedIn in particular from people who just sent me a message saying, "Oh, I saw your profile. Maybe we can have a chat." And most of the time, I must admit, I ignore them because I don't have a lot of time, and I have to be wise what I do with the time that I have. And if someone is not specific, then it's quite difficult to imagine what the conversation will be like. Why would it be interesting to have that conversation? And I think that's one of the mistakes people make. Perhaps they're just kind of looking at people's profiles, sending lots of messages that are not really having the desired impact, rather than maybe go spend a bit more time, a bit more thoughtful to try to engage with people who you really want to engage with. Read some of their content and research their background, and then make the conversation more specific to them, rather than sending kind of a standard message to lots of people. I think scattergun doesn't really work in that space. I think it's much more successful if you approach people thoughtfully, give them a good reason why you've approached them, tell them why you would like to talk to them, what you want to talk to them about, and then you're much better placed to get a response. Because if it's generic, it's like, well, I get so many of these messages, I can't answer them all, so I don't. And virtual networking is harder, but you have to put in the work. And ultimately, I think meeting someone in person is, of course, the best way still to leave a lasting impression and get the most out of a conversation. But even a virtual call is a good start. But yeah, I don't think you can get there by just sending lots of generic messages and emails to people.
I totally agree. It's a huge frustration of mine as well, to be honest. But if you're listening to this and you have sent a generic message to Jan and you'd like a bit of time with him, then he's just giving you the tip on how to get that time. Last thing on kind of academia and your experience with academia. I spend a lot of time with private companies, quite often multinationals that have got generally skill shortages in a certain area. What more can they do to kind of tap into university research and talent to think about the future, do you think?
I mean, when it comes to talent, I think that's actually fairly straightforward, right? I mean, there's so many great programs now, and there are some really excellent students coming out of those programs, and building strategic collaborations with some of those master courses is the easiest way, I think, to be on the radar of those graduates. That could be that you have someone give a presentation, do a guest lecture, a talk, a conversation, panel discussion, whatever format that takes. I think that is an easy way of establishing that connection, and then you have access to a great pool of talent. Taking advantage of the research, I mean, that's the harder part, perhaps. I mean, I in my work try to work quite closely with industry, and often I will have conversations with people who work in the industry. What are the kind of most pressing problems? I talk to policymakers, so I get a good sense of what does the field need in terms of research, what will be actually useful. But a lot of academics don't necessarily do that, and therefore industry might find it harder to engage with them. I think one opportunity to get more access to research and make sure the research that's being done is actually useful is partly to be collaborator in research projects. So there's a lot of publicly funded research grants where companies can team up with universities and you do research that is quite applied, useful for everybody involved. And I think that's a great opportunity for companies to shape academic research. Then, of course, also to fund it. I mean, there's a real funding crisis in academia. It's very competitive, and companies have more flexibilities than the public sector has to fund interesting research. There's a real opportunity there as well, to be not just a partner, but actually a funder of good research, provided that you allow the academics to work independently and not steer what they do too much. But there's clearly an opportunity for industry funding to take advantage of the fact that great independent research can be carried out in these institutions. That is, I think more useful perhaps than just funding a consultant to write a report that says what you wanted to say. So I think those are perhaps a few ways how collaboration can happen.
Yeah, really interesting. I think interesting for a lot of people, to be honest. Yeah. I touched on this very briefly at the start, but I wanted to spend a little bit of time on kind of future predictions. I think you've got a really good global view of energy transition in general. Is there anything that you think is coming that most people don't see yet?
I think a lot of the things that are coming, we kind of already know about. This goes back to our earlier conversation, I think, about innovation and the changes that we will see. So, the transition towards more electrification in the building sector, transport sector, and industry sector is now well underway. I mean, to different degrees in different countries and different subsectors, but it's definitely happening. So we're going to see a lot more of that coming in the next 20 years. We will see continuous build out of renewables. We will see a lot more storage because we will have more of a business case now for storage, with periods of very low cost renewable electricity and periods when there's not enough electricity generated by renewables alone. So there's clearly an opportunity for storage. Then beyond that, I think there's a real question: what other things might happen? I mean, to just some of the technologies that are frequently talked about. I mean, you have fusion being mentioned sometimes, but the running joke in the energy sector is it's always 30 years away, and will it ever happen? So big question mark there. Then small modular reactors keep coming up in discussions about future tech. Hasn't been demonstrated yet commercially. Will it actually work? What will be the cost? Will it scale? Nobody really knows. So I think that's one to watch. Carbon capture and storage has been talked about for a long time. Again, we haven't really seen the deployment at the scale that people have assumed might happen. Green hydrogen. Yeah, I could go on. There's a long list of things that have been talked about, but haven't really demonstrated yet that they can work.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, you have the technologies I already mentioned, around electrification, renewables, and grid storage, which will continue to scale because we now reached, that point where they are cost competitive in a lot of places already.
Yeah. And then particularly regarding the kind of integration of renewables and storage, like you mentioned, where do you see the biggest risks or blind spots in Europe's current approach, particularly regarding the integration of renewables, storage, maybe multi-utility projects?
I mean, long-term storage, long durational storage is still a missing piece,
Yeah.
right? I mean, when you think about the the periods in the winter when it's pretty cold, but you have little wind and a cloud cover. That's called the kalte Dunkelflaute in German. It's now become a term that has been used internationally, curiously.
How do you say it again?
It's a kalte Dunkelflaute, or the dark doldrums is
Okay.
the English translation, but people tend to use the German term in the energy sector. But essentially, it's not just a few hours. You can do batteries. If you talk about a few hours of storage, but if it's several weeks, maybe a couple of weeks where you need storage, or even seasonal storage, where you store energy in the summer and use it in the winter, batteries can't do that. So that's an important piece of the puzzle that we haven't solved yet, and that is, I think, is now going to become something that we will need to solve as we move to a fully decarbonized electricity system. So I think that's one. I mean, industry is, out of the three main end use sectors, buildings, transport, industry. Industry is probably the hardest because it's so diverse, very many different applications, very different temperatures that are required in industrial processes. So decarbonizing that will be hard. We haven't made huge inroads in the past, so I think that will be front and center, all in the context of stiff competition from the US and China, where energy prices are lower than in Europe. So those are just a couple of really, I think, interesting, difficult, but potentially also very promising areas where I think Europe can solve some really hard problems going forward.
Yeah, agreed. Um, and just a couple of, I think, closing reflections, or a couple of questions that I tend to ask most guests that come on here. Um, if you could give a message to every senior leader working on a renewable energy project today, what would it be?
I think to be optimistic is key.
Yeah.
Um, yes, it's messy. The world is a messy place. Politics are difficult, but overall, we're headed in the right direction. And I think those fundamental structural changes are now unstoppable. Yeah, they have really shifted the dial, and I think just being very optimistic about the future would be my number one message to them.
Yeah, awesome. And then finally, where can people follow your work, or connect with you further, Jan?
I think the best way to connect will be on LinkedIn.
Yep.
I have a pretty active profile there, or Blue Sky, or X, but LinkedIn would be the number one platform I would suggest people can follow me on. And I will post there almost daily. So I would suggest people to follow me on LinkedIn. They can also message me, of course, and engage with me further.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on. I think it was a really interesting story about quite a long, lengthy history in the sustainability space, and some really interesting topics on particularly UK and EU governmental issues.
Absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Jan.